Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third in a series of 3 stakeholder trainings being hosted by the Oregon Public Utilities Commission. My name is Nolan Moser. I'm the Chief Administrative Law Judge for the Commission, and I'll be walking you through various presentations today, including a presentation from some of our utility staff. Additionally, as our agenda indicated, we'll close the session with a panel discussion amongst some advocates talking about effective advocacy at the Commission, and those advocates will be joined by Chair Megan Decker at roughly 3 o'clock, we anticipate, based on the rest of the agenda. So the agenda has a couple key things that we'll be going through. We'll start with a very basic overview presentation of the roles and responsibilities of the Commission. That's a presentation that I'll be delivering. We'll follow that up with a presentation from Sarah Hall, a manager in our utility group, who will talk about a topic we're highlighting regarding climate change and utility investment, electrification and electrification planning. So she'll be discussing the variety of dockets that go into our electrification work. And we'll be using that as context for explaining to you how, from a process standpoint, people can participate at the Commission. We'll follow that up with a presentation from myself on intervenor funding. So I'll give a comprehensive update on intervenor funding flowing out of HB 2475. I'll explain sort of where we are with an interim funding option for groups and individuals. And then I will discuss how permanent rules are being developed currently. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, we'll close the session with a panel discussion. So we have a panel of a group of advocates that have varying degrees of experience working with the Commission. Those advocates will be joined by Chair Megan Decker. And we have some questions to spur some conversation amongst those advocates and Chair Decker. So that should be very interesting as well. Then we'll finish up. So this training will be recorded and available online on our trainings page. And it'll be available at the same place as our other trainings. We've conducted 2 so far this year. The first one was on differential rates, essentially support for customers of lower incomes. And then our second was on wildfire related issues. So each of these trainings are subject focused, but they generally cover the same concepts, which is process, how process works at the Commission, how to participate at the Commission. And they each include a discussion at the end where advocates talk amongst themselves and offer advice on effective advocacy before the Commission. I encourage, and we encourage questions and participation in the sessions. So the idea here is to get out information about effective advocacy at the Commission, help people understand how we work so that they can be more effective. And we want to hear from you. So when you have questions, or something isn't particularly clear, please feel free to interrupt us. You can do it a number of different ways. So the primary way that we'll ask that you interject and get involved in the conversation, ask questions, is to use the raise your hand feature of Zoom, which I think most of you are probably familiar with. But if you hover over your Zoom screen, you'll see a raise hand option at the bottom. That's how you raise your hand. And we have Ellie Knoll, who's running the meeting from our Administrative Hearings Division. She will help us understand when we've got someone raising their hand. We also have a couple other staffers engaged who can help pay attention for that. And I'll call on you. We'll unmute you at that point. You'll be able to ask your question. Additionally, you can put questions into the chat. They won't be visible to all participants, but they'll go straight to staff, and staff will read them out to us so that we can answer them for you. And then finally, if you're joining us by phone only, you can also ask questions you'll want to press *6. Essentially, that presents you with the opportunity to virtually raise your hand, and then we'll unmute you and you can ask your question. So with that, I think we'll get started, and I'll start by discussing background and roles and responsibilities here at the Commission. So I'm going to share my screen. Just a moment, bear with me here. Okay. So I just want to confirm, maybe Ellie, you can help me and make sure that folks are seeing my presentation here.
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you very much, Ellie. All right. So I reviewed some of the goals earlier. Really, we want to make sure that folks, this particular newer stakeholders, these trainings are geared towards our newer, less experienced stakeholders, that they understand the roles and responsibilities of those of us that work at the Commission and the commissioners themselves, that you have a general understanding of how the PUC makes decisions, and then we'll discuss that in the context of a specific issue, in this case, climate change and utility investment, with a highlight, for example's sake, on transportation electrification. We're going to provide resources and information to advocates, primarily around intervener funding, so that folks can understand how to access that. And then we're going to hear from folks on best practices for engagement with the Commission, and hopefully we'll have a robust conversation there at the end of the day. Okay. So let's begin. I'm going to make sure that I stop every few slides for questions, and Ellie and the rest of the team, just please, if I'm not seeing someone, please interrupt me. Feel free as we go on, so I make sure that I answer questions for folks. And just a reminder, the primary way you'll ask questions or interject is to use the raise your hand feature, then we'll call on you. But you can also chat your questions, and those will be seen by staff and relayed to us. All right. So we begin with something real basic. Who is the Commission? Well, the Commission is 3 people who are experts in their field, delegated specific responsibilities from the legislature. So states have this is not uncommon, of course. Most, I think all U.S. states have regulatory bodies to protect consumers and ensure rational utility development for monopoly or semi-monopoly utilities, and that is what the Commission does. The Commission's mission is to ensure reliable, high-quality utility services at just and reasonable rates. And the Commission has a commitment to strong analysis, independent decision-making, and very importantly, for the purposes of our discussion today, open and fair process. And that's really what this training is intended to support, to ensure that people understand our processes. It's one thing to be open and fair, but if the process is so complicated that people can't access it, then it's not really serving that purpose. So the idea is to ensure today that we make sure that people have a better and better understanding of how we work, so they can access the Commission and effectively advocate for their views and positions in front of the Commission. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about why the Commission matters. So very basically, utilities aren't like other businesses. Essentially, the services are essential, and they're tied to major infrastructure that can't be easily developed, and that really isn't subject to a lot of competition. Customers generally can't look for alternatives, so you can't really get electricity from another source, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to build competing wires to a neighborhood. You can look back at old photos of New York, for example, at the turn of the century, and see a time when utilities weren't regulated. And the thing you'll notice in those photos is wires everywhere, because individual companies could run wires competing wires to homes and businesses, and it created some problems, as I imagine you understand. So the idea is that we don't want it's inefficient and costly to have duplicative infrastructure. And so we have certain monopolies for utility infrastructure. But because these companies are monopolies, we have to ensure, because we don't have technically competition between different providers, that rates are just and reasonable. And so the legislature has delegated a lot of responsibilities in that area to the commission. We deal with rate regulated companies primarily, but not exclusively, which means that these companies can only charge rates or charges to customers that are determined to be lawful, just and reasonable by the commission after a proceeding here, and after the public and after customers of that utility have the opportunity to participate and make their views heard. The legislature has also provided us a lot of other responsibilities, as I'm sure many of you are aware. Utilities are so important for environmental and social impact that the PUC is increasingly a body designated to implement complicated policy goals that the legislature has delegated to us through an open process. So in sum, we get a lot of work from the legislature, in part because of our open process and our ability to listen to the public. And so our process is extremely important. Ultimately, the commission is really a listening machine and a decision-making machine. It's our responsibility to take in information from the public, take in information from stakeholders, utilities, and staff, and then issue decisions, make decisions. And those are the processes that we utilize to take in that information needs to accommodate all stakeholders, so that we can properly take into account community views. So part of what we're discussing today is ways in which we can do that effectively, and we want to get you information so that you can understand how we work, so that you can provide those views. At the end of all of it, the rates change and utility policy rules or requirements are established or updated, and development of on-the-ground projects happens or doesn't, and money gets invested in one solution or another. So the decisions that the commission makes have significant real-world consequences, and they're not always direct. Sometimes they're indirect, but they do matter and they are important, which is why stakeholders of all stripes are very interested in what we do. So I'll talk a little next about some specific responsibilities delegated to the commission by the legislature. And before I do that, I'm going to stop and make sure we don't have any questions that have popped up. So I'm just going to take a look here. Okay, doesn't look like we have any so far, which is fine. All right. So moving on. Responsibilities delegated by the legislature. So the commissions in general are created by the legislature to protect consumers and balance the interests of utilities and consumers, and increasingly other interests. So as you'll hear about a little later today, the commission is now balancing really the societal and environmental interests, as well as rate impact and consumer interests, as well as the interests of a healthy utility. So there's a lot more inputs now than there used to be. And we do think about the interest of the utility. And you probably wonder why. Why isn't it just about the consumer or these other goals? And really it's so that utilities can function effectively and attract capital and ultimately provide services that we all need and want. So it's a responsibility of the commission to ensure that all of these goals that we've been delegated by the legislature are achieved, but also that the utility can effectively function, that it can borrow money, that it can make investments, and that it can provide the services that we need. We have to balance a lot of different questions. Utilities need to make enough money essentially to be stable, to be able to build and maintain needed infrastructure, but not so much that their return is not consistent with industry standards or so lucrative that customers suffer. So it's a balancing act for the commission, and the commission really solicits a lot of input to help figure out that balance. And the commission has a wide range of legal discretion to issue decisions with different outcomes. So it's important to know that that the commission can go many different directions, and that's where the stakeholders come in, and why it's so valuable to get broad stakeholder input. Okay, so I'll move on. We'll talk next about directly who we regulate. So we work with electric, natural gas, water, and telecommunications utilities that are investor-owned for rate-regulated services. So what that means is we're dealing with utilities that essentially are, unless the commission is here, are not exactly directly accountable to their customers. They are in the sense of the service they provide, but their rates are what we're taking a look at along with other policies. It's important to distinguish that from the utilities that we don't regulate. So we don't regulate municipal or local government utilities. For example, we regulate those investor-owned water utilities across the state, but I live in Portland, for example, and our water is provided by the city of Portland, and so the rates that I pay for my water are not regulated or reviewed by the Public Utilities Commission. The idea there is that for municipal or co-op providers of these utility services, they are directly accountable to, in theory, to consumers through either local governments or, in the case of co-ops, through membership structures, voting structures, etc. Additionally, we don't regulate the services of telecommunication providers which are non-rate regulated. So cell phone plans, cable providers, things like that. That's an area where we don't have regulatory authority. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, I mentioned earlier that the legislature is asking the commission to do more and more each year. And there is quite a bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. So as I mentioned earlier, the legislature sees the commission as because utilities have such important environmental and social impacts, the legislature sees the commission as a really important conduit for achieving policy outcomes that legislators are looking to move forward. And so the PUC has become the vehicle for a lot of change. And most recently, just a few examples here, we have Senate Bill 1547, which accelerated development of renewable energy and is moving our utilities to exit coal generation. We have HB 2475. I'll be talking about a portion of that later, dealing with intervenor funding. But that bill created the opportunity for the commission to develop and approve differential rates that support equity and support disadvantaged communities and lower income customers. We have, major legislation from 2021, HB 2021, that ultimately aims to reduce utility sector greenhouse gas emissions dramatically and move us towards a cleaner, more climate-friendly generation system. And then we have telecommunications focused legislation as well. that seeks to bolster programs that the commission is responsible for administering. There's a bunch of other examples of this. Community solar, which is something that the commission actively oversees, is a broad directive from the legislature. We have resiliency goals that have been set by the legislature. And I think something that a lot of you may know, we also are more and more responsible for helping ensure that utilities are preparing us for wildfires, and that are operating in a way that reduce wildfire risk, and that help communities prepare for future wildfires. Oh, looks like I've got a direct message here. I didn't know we could do that, but I do have one. Jim Kreider, an advocate who practices in front of the commission quite a bit, asks, how are the costs of fire prevention and carbon reduction being passed on to customers? How can we advocate for the consumer and share costs with investors? That's a great question. So, so to answer Jim's question, those costs are incorporated in rates really through one mechanism, and that's a rate proceeding. And rate proceedings can be really comprehensive. They can involve really every part of the rate base that a utility has, or they can be more targeted, focused on specific programs. The place at which advocates can have the most impact on those costs and the sharing of those of how the costs are allocated between customers and investors, or between customer classes, is in a rate case. And I'm going to talk later during Sarah's presentation about rate cases and about how you participate in them. But they're the primary forum in which the commission deals directly with reviewing utility investments and allocating the costs associated with those investments between consumers and investors. So I hope that answers the question. Okay, and those are just a little preview of that part of the conversation. Those are contested cases, meaning that they're like litigated proceedings. So they require a little more work to get involved in as an advocate. And we'll talk about what's necessary to effectively advocate in a rate case.
You have another question, Nolan.
Okay, great. Is this a verbal question? Or are we gonna just make sure we unmute the person?
Tim Miller, you should be unmuted.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Nolan. And this goes back a couple slides, but
Sure.
I really appreciate the overview. You were describing the challenge that the commission has in balancing the needs of utilities and the ratepayers. And I'm curious, across all the hundreds of decisions that the commission has made over the years, I wonder if you could tell us about a time when maybe the commission got it wrong and a utility was actually unable to access capital it needed to maintain a stable system. Secondly, if you could help us understand, you mentioned that typically that access to capital is borrowing to be able to make investments that the utility needs to make. And I wonder if you could help us understand the connection between the utility's ability to service its debt and the very different topic of the utility delivering a return to its equity investors. One can service debt without having much return for equity, but I'd like to understand how the commission views the linkage between those things, if any.
Okay, yeah, sure. I will do my best. I am not as expert in this area as some of our staff witnesses who specialize in this, but I will definitely answer both questions. So the first question, As I think your question probably indicate, you're probably aware. I certainly cannot think of an instance where, at least here in Oregon, a commission decision jeopardized a utility's ability to get access to capital. That has not occurred here, at least in my tenure. We've had some challenging cases here at the. Oh, I'm sorry. Your first question was: is there a situation where I just want to make sure I'm getting it right. So the question was, where did we get it wrong, and where did a utility not have access to capital based on our decision? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah,
Okay.
given that you're balancing these things, I would think that from
Yeah.
time to time, you'd get it wrong and
Yeah.
develop in difficulty of accessing capital.
Yes, I see what you're saying. So yeah, and I think I was answering correctly then. So in my tenure, certainly the commission has not gotten into a position, or utilities haven't gotten into a position where access to capital has been jeopardized by a commission decision. So I think that's the answer to number one. The answer to number two, again, subject to just the fact that there are probably people on staff who are far better experts in this than me. You're right that there's a difference between the rate at which a utility borrows money and the rate of return. Overall, the commission is sensitive to anything that will increase borrowing costs. So, for example, if a utility has a rate of return that is significantly below industry average, that may affect the ability of the utility to borrow money at a competitive rate, because groups like Moody's or the rating services may determine that the utility's business model is not attractive to investment, or is fundamentally risky because of the nature of the commission it works with, and may downgrade its credit rating. And that, in theory, again, all in theory, because you're right, we haven't run into a situation like that, at least here in Oregon. And that, in theory, may make borrowing costs higher and borrowing more challenging. So I think that's the nexus that's there. But I certainly see your point about sort of a real world example of when it didn't work out.
Thank you.
So if you have any follow up.
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. So those were great questions. Appreciate those. So I'll move on to the next slide. I think I was in the middle of talking a little bit about wildfires. I'll just finish that up real briefly, but the commission's doing quite a bit on wildfire risk right now. We've got a lot of new directives from the legislature, and eventually investments associated with wildfire mitigation will find their way into rates as well, as Jim Kreider indicated in his question. Some additional directives from the legislature. We have significant safety standards that we implement, and these have come to light more as we've worked on the wildfire issues. But a lot of folks aren't aware that we have quite a bit of responsibility around safety, whether it's wires, whether it's pipelines. We develop safety rules and implement some of both state and federal safety standards for the industry we regulate. So I encourage folks to learn more about that. Moving on. So I'll talk a little bit now. Oh, I'm sorry, my mouse crazy there. I'll talk a little bit more now about our individual commissioners. So we have three commissioners here in Oregon who make decisions through majority vote. And our chair is Megan Decker, who served 2 terms as commissioner and is currently the chair. Chair Decker is an attorney and has had a number of high-profile legal responsibilities. She has a background in land use and energy policy, regulation, and litigation. And she has a tremendous amount of responsibilities, as I'm sure many of you are aware. She is technically the head of the agency. So in theory, all staff report to her, that indirectly through the executive director of the agency. And she's delegated the authority to run the agency as an administrator. So she wears a lot of hats. So not only is she digging into each of these issues, and I can attest how much time and energy she puts in to analysis, but she manages every public meeting. But as I said earlier, she's also responsible for a lot of administrative responsibilities. So we're very lucky she has a lot of energy, which I'm sure you've seen on display. She'll be joining us later for the panel discussion as well. Letha Tawney has served also 2 terms with the commission. She's the one non-lawyer at the commission, which is really great because she brings a sort of a unique perspective and a more practical perspective sometimes to some issues. She has an expert background in the utility business model, specifically with electric utilities, state regulation, and clean energy development. Commissioner Tawney has really recently taken a lead on wildfire issues. So she's become quite an expert in that area, and the other commissioners, I don't exactly defer to her, but they definitely look to her to help us understand what's happening regionally, what's happening in California, and she's done a really impressive job of highlighting this issue. And she's actually looked at other commissions as sort of a leader on this issue, which we're quite proud of. Commissioner Thompson is our newest commissioner. He joined us in 2019. He's an attorney with a background in energy and administrative law. He's had roles at utility at the Northwest Natural, but he's also represented renewable energy developers, consumer-owned utilities. So he's had a really interesting and wide-ranging background, and like our other commissioners, Commissioner Thompson really digs into the record at an extraordinary level. So I can tell you personally that the commissioners, at least in this state, really do listen and really do dig in on these complicated issues and very much value your participation. And when you participate, they're going to hear you. It's not going to be an afterthought for them. So our commissioners, just in general, must decide hundreds of individual issues every year. Many of these issues consisting of complicated topics with a variety of difficult positions to manage, and that's where staff comes in. And we have an extensive staff, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that next. So before I do, I'll pause for any questions. Okay, not hearing any or seeing any. I'll talk a little bit about the structure of staff. So the commissioners are at the top of this decision-making apparatus, and they're supported by the utility program, which is really where the bulk of our staff, I'd say, roughly 50% of the agency is located, which is really the brain of the commission. I mean, the utility program is making recommendations. The utility program is working directly with you as stakeholders, and providing the analysis that the commission takes a look at when it considers various positions. The commission, the staff analyzes filings, it reviews new legislation, and it helps us move forward in all of our processes. So in a public meeting, for example, typically they're organized around a staff recommendation. A utility might propose a new tariff or a new filing or a new program, and staff will review that. They'll engage with stakeholders, they'll highlight the issues, provide background information, and then they'll prepare a recommendation, and everyone really reacts to that. So the commissioners are reacting to it, and in many cases, you as stakeholders are reacting to it. In the contested case context, which is, I'll talk about later, our sort of litigated proceedings, staff is a party. They're an important party, but they're really just one of many parties. The utility is a party, and you as an individual stakeholder getting engaged as a party as well. So that's how they make their recommendation in contested cases. They'll put forward an argument, they'll have testimony, just like any other party. In rulemaking, staff play a really key role. So when a piece of legislation gets passed, for example, we'll have a rulemaking. We'll turn something that is very general into something more specific directives for the utility and the public. And staff leads that process, especially initially, and works to facilitate stakeholder involvement and eventually proposes draft rule language for the commission. Next, I'll talk about the Administrative Hearings Division. That's the division of the agency that I'm responsible for. And we really just support the decision-making process. So we're really more at the end of the process. We're helping the commissioners as they consider a final decision in a public meeting. In the case of a contested case, we're managing the case. We have individual judges that help move the process along. They hold the hearings, they set the schedule, they review the filings, and they produce the orders for the commission based on the decisions that the commission makes. So we do a lot of writing in our group. We're writing a lot of orders. We're writing a lot of memoranda for the commission. And then in the rulemaking process, which we'll talk about later, we have a key role in what is called the formal portion of the rulemaking, the final part of the rulemaking. We really lead the process there. So all of these duties are really delegated. The commissioners, in theory, could do all of this themselves, but given how much work is before the commission, that hasn't been possible really since the commission was created. And so we have extensive staff to help with that needed analysis and support. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some key terms you'll hear today, just so that we have some familiarity with specific language. We already talked about rate regulated a little bit. And that's a company that must clear its rate changes with the commission. A public meeting. So this is the type of meeting that we had this morning, where the commissioners are up on the dais, or in this case, the virtual dais. They're hearing from everyone, and eventually, based on an agenda, making a specific decision. Any time the commission meets as a group of 2 or more, essentially when there's a quorum, that's a public meeting, and that has to be open to everyone and noticed to the public. A docket, for those of you not aware, is a tracked matter at the commission. It's essentially a file where all the activity is going to take place for a specific issue. If we're contemplating a new rule on wildfires, for example, that rulemaking will be assigned a docket number, and that's where everything will occur. You can track everything by tracking that docket. As I said earlier, contested case is a trial-like proceeding. We don't use this for every issue here, but we do use it for some issues. An advice filing is a request to change a tariff from a utility or to make a programmatic change. A rulemaking, as we discussed earlier, is a proceeding where we take something more general from the legislature and turn it into specific directives for utilities and others. A workshop, which some of you have probably participated in, is a collaborative meeting used to solicit feedback to utilities or staff or commissioners on a specific question. And I think we have a question from Arlene. Ellie, can we unmute her?
You should be able to unmute now.
Okay. Looks like I'm unmuted.
Yes, you are. We can hear you.
Yeah, my question is any work being done on the safety issues involved with the idea of adding hydrogen to natural gas in existing pipelines as a means to distribute it, hydrogen.
I see. That's a good question. I am not aware of any. There is a docket, I believe it's UM 2178, and maybe some of the utility staff on the meeting can correct me if I'm wrong there. That deals with some of the natural gas issues that we're going to deal with as the system transitions in one way or another. That might be a place where that issue can be raised. Our safety staff generally works on, it has a narrow focus primarily on the directives were given by state legislation or by federal legislation. So if there's a piece of federal legislation that requires a safety standard associated with, putting hydrogen in the pipes, then that's the kind of thing we would tackle. But the safety staff typically only deals with those issues if there's some sort of requirement that we have safety standards for those. So where there is no requirement, that might be the kind of thing that could be discussed in an open investigation like UM 2178. And I don't know if someone more familiar with that docket than me from staff has any additional thoughts, but that would be my suggestion.
All right, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Arlene. You can find information about that docket on our website. Okay. I got a couple more terms here, and then we'll finish up with this part of the presentation. Some more things you'll hear today. Filing. So this is a document sent to the commission through our filing center. And then ex parte communication. So in a contested case, I'll talk about this further. Our commissioners are really acting as judges. They're making decisions as like a judge would, and there are certain communication restrictions associated with that. So we'll talk about that when we get to contested cases. We have another question from Kathy.
Yes, I'm just wondering, I haven't seen any references to the integrated resource planning process. Is that going to be discussed later? Because that's a place where the effect of climate change is really being felt.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we can definitely, I will talk about that probably at the end of the next presentation. So I'll make sure to spend 5 minutes or so talking about the IRP process. I think you're exactly right. We're using transportation, electrification, and planning as sort of a way to talk about how you participate in these types of dockets. And what we'll show you there is pretty applicable to the IRP process as well. But I'll explain how that works together. So thank you for bringing that up. We'll make sure to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll note that Keisha Brockman with our staff has forwarded around a link to UM 2178. So I think I do have the right docket in mind when I was talking about natural gas earlier. Okay. So really that's that first introductory presentation on what the commission is, sort of just the very basic information for you. If you have any questions that weren't addressed, you can send them to us at the hearings division. So I'll leave this up here for a moment. And then you can review all of these recordings on the following link. So this is like I said, the third in a series of 3 trainings. All right. So we're let me do a time check here. We're 45 minutes in to the day. We're gonna move on now to Sarah's presentation. And as we discuss Sarah, I'm gonna go ahead and and present your presentation on my screen. So give me one moment to load it up here. And while we're doing that, maybe you can introduce yourself to the group.
Thanks, Nolan. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Hall. I'm Resource and Programs Development Manager within the Utility Program at PUC. So I am part of the utility staff, and my team of professionals and analysts manage a range of energy efficiency, demand response, transportation, electrification, solar, distribution system planning, storage, and many different grid level resource and planning initiatives that are very important. And here we're focusing on transportation electrification as kind of an illustrative case study to talk about some interesting elements as a non-contested case and as a rulemaking, both formal and informal. And Nolan, anytime you're ready for the next slide, we could do that. I'm also going to be joined by my colleague Isel Watson, who's our OPUC DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director. And Isel was an important part of our activities last year and this year in transportation electrification.
Great. I will move us forward. And so I assume that everyone can see the slides properly. Is that correct?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Thanks, Nolan. So
Sure.
today we want to use this TE or transportation electrification work as a way to delve into what a fairly robust non-contested case can look like at the PUC with your participation. Where you're going to look at rulemaking, informal and formal phases. And Nolan will then transition to contested cases, and he'll touch on the IRP and rate case. IRP as a hybrid type of case, and the rate case is as a contested case. We welcome your comments throughout. If you want to raise your hand or send a chat message, we'll be able to just interact as we go along, and then at the end as well. Okay, next slide, please. Nolan, I guess actually it's back to you. I appreciate you speaking a little bit to set the framework here for these different kinds of cases.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I'll start with non-contested cases. So these are cases that really any decision that the commission makes that is not made in a contested case, in a trial-like proceeding, is essentially a non-contested case. And these cases must be made, or these decisions must be made in an open public meeting. And so, oh, sorry, I accidentally advanced the slide. There we go. So the majority of the dockets, the majority of decisions that the commission makes are made in this manner. So for those of you that witnessed the public meeting that we had this meeting, for example, I believe there were 5 agenda items, regular agenda items, that is. 3 of them were relatively significant dockets with a lot of discussion, 2 of them presentations. And the commission, what the commission typically does is, as I said earlier, we'll start with a staff recommendation, and then we'll hear from the public, and all of that is done in public. So because of our public meeting law, the commission must make decisions out in the open, and we do so through these regular public meetings or a special public meeting. All public meetings are noticed on our website, so that people are aware of what's happening ahead of time. We publish agendas again, so you can prepare for the meeting and be able to participate with good resources. We do a lot of investigation dockets, compliance dockets through these processes. Typically, cases not affecting the direct rights of parties will be dealt with through this public meeting process. And these non-contested cases are not subject to evidentiary rules as well. Rulemakings are also decided in, oh, I'm sorry, let me go back. Rulemakings are also decided in public meetings, but for the moment, I'm going to talk about non-contested cases. So these are typically cases that are time sensitive. So often, for example, utilities will be proposing a new rate or a change to a rate that must take place by a specific date associated with one tariff. And that has to be made according to that specific deadline. And so we'll put it on a regular public meeting agenda in advance of that deadline. Often less contentious matters or matters that do not require a lot of fact finding are in the non-contested case process, the regular agenda process. And so if you're interested in a docket and it is part of one of these processes, there are some advantages to you. You can work a little more collaboratively with staff, and staff really manages these dockets from beginning to end. And of course, you can show up in front of the commission and make your case for an alternative recommendation, something different than what staff has proposed. Next, we'll talk about rulemaking here. And the reason we're going through these ahead of Sarah's presentation is so that you can have some background information on process, and then she'll show you sort of what that has looked like and what it will look like in the context of transportation electrification. So rulemakings are another collaborative staff-led process. Again, as I suggested earlier, typically what we're dealing with is a piece of legislation and trying to translate that into more definite rules for utilities or for others. And the ultimate goal is the development of a proposed rule. And we break down rulemakings into two phases. The first phase is informal, and that is that staff-led process. There's going to be a lot of workshops. Staff's going to solicit comments. Once you sign up to participate in a docket, you'll get notification of all of this. You'll have the opportunity to participate in meetings. You'll be able to suggest changes to the rule. You'll have the opportunity to collaborate directly with staff or other advocates. And then staff is going to work to resolve any disputes there may be amongst the various stakeholders. And then ultimately we'll come up with a recommendation that they'll put before the commission. That will go to a public meeting, those same public meetings that we discussed a minute ago. And then the commission will make a decision to open a formal rulemaking or not. So the next phase in a rulemaking is the formal phase. So this is where my group, the Administrative Hearings Division, comes in. So we assign an administrative law judge to manage this phase. And as the title indicates, it's more formal. There's less collaboration and less opportunity to influence the rules through a workshop, a meeting with staff or something like that. Your arguments need to be more targeted. So we do potentially sometimes have some workshops in the formal phase, although it's far less common than in the informal period. But people submit written comments on proposed rules. We will almost always have a public comment hearing. So that's an opportunity for anyone to come forward and present oral comment on a proposed rule and say that the rule is well written, or I want the rule to change, or this rule should not be adopted, etc. We accept written comments up to a specific date. So we set a date, and after that date, there's no more comment. We don't accept any comments, and the commissioners are ready to think about their decision and make a decision. So the commissioners use a period of time to review all the comments. They review the record. And then they have a public meeting to make a final decision. This is rulemakings or decisions that are made in public meetings. So typically what we do is our ALJ, our administrative law judge, will, like staff does for a lot of the public meetings, will prepare a recommendation. They'll have a proposed rule. They'll outline the various comments that you or other stakeholders made, and they'll suggest specific changes based on their understanding of the law and also based on the various proposals that we've seen to date. And the commission reviews that. The commission has an open meeting discussion and debate about what to do, and then makes a decision. And shortly after that decision is made, if the commission approves a rule, then that rule goes into effect and it is binding. Okay, I think at this stage, Sarah, if I'm correct, I'm going to transition it back over to you.
Thanks, Nolan. Great. So today I'd like to discuss the story of transportation electrification planning and the robust engagement that we've appreciated from stakeholders during the 2021 and year and continuing into this year. So this is an ongoing story. And so we'll have kind of up to the minute updates. And I think, you know, it's an interesting story because we have two major state policy drivers, at least, and we have two different kinds of cases, as Nolan touched on, starting with a non-contested case or investigation into what we're calling a TE investment framework, and then moving to rulemaking so that we reflect new policy directives into the Oregon Administrative Rules Division 87, which is what governs transportation electrification planning by electric utilities. So it's got a nice life cycle that I think we can talk about. So maybe next slide. And, you know, so I mentioned here the two major state policy drivers. And as you know, transportation electrification is a major priority by the state and has been reflected through the Governor Brown's executive order, which was issued in, I think, March of 2020. That's the little yellow page there, but that set greenhouse gas emission goals for the state. And it also directed state agencies, including the PUC, to support utility investment in TE infrastructure in ways that had reasonably could be seen to benefit customers and to reduce GHG emissions. So that was a changing policy driver that you'll see played out. And then more recently, we had a new law passed last spring, House Bill 2165, which brought forward major new considerations in the evaluation of electric utility investments. And thanks for noting that TE henceforth I'll be using to mean transportation electrification. So I'd like to translate this process, beginning in 2021. Staff brought forward a recommendation that was supported through a commission order to, at that time, suspend and investigate what was a fleet filing by PGE for a line extension allowance, and staff made a recommendation to suspend that filing for further stakeholder review, and also to bring forward a more holistic look at the way that transportation electrification's investments are evaluated and reviewed by the commission. And the commission accepted that through Order 21026 in January of 2021, and that set forward a new investigation, a new non-contested case. The docket number for that case was UM 2165, and And that became a lengthy investigation. The goal of that was to better reflect state policy of the benefits of TE, to more holistically review TE filings so that advocates and commissioners and utilities and staff, everyone involved, could evaluate portfolio level investments for TE. And so that, those were some of the drivers that were behind this TE investment framework investigation. And let's see, we can head on back to the slides. And what we see here was that commission, or that the staff initiated an investigation, and knowing in doing so that the staff might come up with recommendations, should they be supported by the commission, that would involve revising the organ administrative rules, the Division 87 rules that govern the plans that electric utilities submit for approval to the commission in order to have that commission approval for their TE investments. And so I'll talk a little bit about the additional wild card that happened during the course of this investigation, but Nolan, if you could go to the next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, in 2021, we started an investigation. That was a discovery, and I want to tell you a little bit more about that. Ezel and I will talk to you. Some of you, I think, were involved in that, but we were directed by commission to really do a robust stakeholder process that involved learning and best practices in different approaches to evaluation for TE, and then to come back to the commission with what was called an investment framework, so a more holistic analytic framework to evaluate TE. The wild card, though, was this passage of the House Bill 2165. This bill, signed into law in about May of last year, put forward some major new considerations that were very time sensitive. We needed to, for example, assist the utilities with clarity on how to submit a new kind of budget for TE. House Bill 2165 did a number of things. The first was to create a monthly meter surcharge, which was 1/4 of 1% of retail electric sales that would be earmarked just for TE investments. And the bill also requires utilities to make reasonable attempts to spend at least half of that on low income, or not low income, I'm sorry, on underserved communities. And so the utilities and staff recognize the need for clarity around the process to submit the budgets for those monthly meter surcharges, and the kinds of requirements the commission would have in reviewing and approving that, and the reporting that the bill requires. The bill also set forth a number of other major considerations. One was a new kind of measure type for infrastructure, and new considerations for the approval of infrastructure measures that would allow them to be recoverable through rates. So there's a ratepayer impact that the commission will need to evaluate. And the bill did some other things in terms of TE planning that would need to be reflected in new rules. So staff and stakeholders knew that during the course of last year, we were going to need to bring into scope of the investigation that legislative implementation guidance. And we also knew that coming out of the investigation would be a rulemaking. And so now we are in a rulemaking, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. During the course of my talk here, I also included links to all the references that I'm making. So once these slides are posted, you'll be able to just to kind of delve into some of the statutes, documents, and orders that I'm referencing. So let's go ahead and move ahead. In 2021, staff worked with stakeholders to scope and lead a non-contested case investigation, as I mentioned. And we had, over the course of 5 months, staff led 7 workshops. It was a lot of fun. I think that we all learned a lot. We enjoyed fantastic participation by stakeholders. I've listed here the workshop topics, and they range from kind of a current baseline of what there is today. What are the regulatory tools today that utilities use and that the commission used to evaluate and approve TE investments? What are the current laws at that time? What are some other states doing around evaluating TE investments and better balancing the public interest in doing so? And those interests include recognizing the benefits of and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, equity considerations, and other kinds of societal benefits that accrue from transportation electrification. We looked at benefit cost analysis in the context of portfolios. We brought in many sister agency leaders in the space so that we could really understand what others are doing in related agencies in transportation, ODOT and ODO in particular, and DEQ. And as you can see, we delved into equity. And with that, I would like to pass the microphone over to my colleague, Ezel Watson, tell us a little bit about his leadership on this docket.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to focus in really quickly. As a part of the transportation electrification investigation, there were a few elements of equity that I thought that the PUC staff could focus on. Distributional justice or distributional equity, which essentially refers to the distribution of benefits and burdens across various populations, with an objective to ensure that populations don't receive, or people don't receive, an inordinate share of the burdens, and that people are not denied access to benefits. Additionally, there was the idea of procedural justice, focusing on who is included in the decision-making processes. Finally, there's the idea of recognition justice that requires an understanding of historic and ongoing inequalities. And so that's where we focused some of our efforts. Some outcomes that I saw, or that we saw, one was the addition of a workshop dedicated specifically to underserved communities. Two, there were a list of questions that Sarah and her team sought to grapple with about disparate impact, and also to grapple with the idea of historical distrust based on regulatory decisions that maybe were not made by our commission, but that still impact public perception, especially relative to underserved or environmental justice communities. I have exceeded my 1 minute and 45 seconds that I allotted for myself. Sarah did not put that time limit on me, but I wanted to offer the opportunity to ask questions, and I know there'll be questions maybe later. So I wanted to focus there. We focused on distributional justice, recognition justice, and procedural justice, and we sought to include voices in a meaningful way and allow recommendations that were made to actually influence our process. I'll yield the balance of my time.
Thanks, Isel. I see a few chat comments. Don't know if we should pause now to address. Okay, I think I see a few from Keisha. Yeah, would anyone like to at this stage comment or ask any questions before I move along? Okay, one thing that Isel left out was his leadership on knowledge. I see you've raised your hand. His leadership on operating guidelines. And so do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Isel? Because I think this is something that has been spawned and been really seen as a best practice in other proceedings.
Sure. One of the things that we are concerned with is not only the what of equity, but the how. And one thing that I thought was critically important, or we identified as critically important, were community operating agreements that would allow for better sharing of airtime during workshop processes, that would also hold us all capable of adequate and active listening skills, that also help to prevent some of the skirmishes that may arise as a result of competing ideas. So, and we have noticed that as a best practice that this has been adopted in commission proceedings, and we've noticed that utilities have begun to continue to evolve the idea of operating agreements. Thank you so much, Sarah, for calling that out. I had so many notes, and I was like, I wanted to stay within the allotted time. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate that.
Definitely. Did we have a question?
Yes, I have a question. This very detailed process that has gone into researching the impacts of transportation electrification, does that same process go into other PUC matters in regards to equity?
It's a great question. This was a lengthy and quite an involved stakeholder process. There's no question. It was 5 months and is resulted in a pretty major staff policy recommendation and the initiation of a rulemaking. I think Isel may want to respond. There are several very important equity and low income related dockets that we could share as a follow-on here too. So the length and scope of investigations, I think, is very variable. We're cognizant of the the time that staff and stakeholders can devote to a range of important issues. So however, when there's a new bill or a new policy requirement, we do want to take the time to drive a robust process. So I think if we want to refer to some specific equity related dockets, maybe we could follow up, either Isel or Nolan, if you want to follow up now, or we could follow up in writing as well.
I think we could probably do both. I think one thing that I might, the way I probably would initially answer Knowledge's question is, the short answer is no, we don't use the exact same equity investigation process that we use for TE in all of our, every commission proceeding or every PUC involved activity. Though this process was very much eye-opening for the PUC relative to disparate impact and how we need to sometimes slow down to investigate that a little bit more. So that was something that I think has been gleaned from the TE process thus far. Hopefully that answers a portion of the question, at least, Knowledge.
And thanks, Isel. Proceedings relative to House Bill 2475, House Bill 3141, the public purpose charge and equity metrics developed relative to energy trust delivery, UM 2111, COVID impacts and other equity related work in the implementation of the new clean energy bill, House Bill 2021, and that docket is 2225. So those are some major proceedings that have really central equity related and energy justice related conversations. Among others. Okay. Well, I hope that answered your question somewhat, and we can continue. So how did this all result? I mean, what came of all of this work? Next slide, please. So in the process, there was, as I mentioned, a bill that the governor signed into law about May of last year. And this is a complicated sort of chart here showing the different work streams or requirements that bill required the PUC to implement. And on behalf of the legislature and with stakeholders and utilities. I've listed some links here, but this Gantt chart that you see is on our website at the link below. And I think I've also listed the bill, just the language of the bill itself. But the point here I'm trying to make is that we engage with stakeholders in depth and utilities on how you all wanted to see the bill implemented. So where there was some discretion around the way that we needed to revise the rules and then evaluate the next utility TE plans, we went out to the participants in the workshop and said, hey, would you let us know verbally as we talk, and would you also fill out a survey? And so we got survey responses, and we put forward 2 pathways. And I think it was interesting. I didn't realize before I worked at the PUC that this level of iteration was possible, and I think it was great to have stakeholder input. Ultimately, the feedback we got was conduct the rulemaking so that the new rules reflect the staff recommendation and the requirements from the new statute, House Bill 2165. And then those rules will help utilities know what to put in their next TE plans. And so we went with pathway 2 down here. But I wanted to provide this as an illustration of the way that utility and stakeholder input, that from advocates, from Citizens Utility Board, from utilities, from individuals, anybody in those workshops really had an impact in what staff did to implement the requirements of this bill. So if you can follow me so far, we're now in rulemaking. So let's take the next slide. This is a shot, some screenshots here, just to allow me to thank stakeholders for all their input that they took time to write and have posted to the service list. So the investigation that I'm discussing, the docket number is UM 2165. And if you go into eDockets, which I've listed the link for, you can pull up. If you have to enter UM 2165 as docket number, you can pull up a really treasure trove of fantastic, detailed comments on all of the workshops. And this really helped inform staff's recommendation in what to bring forward to the commission. It also helped set some common understanding and differences of opinion and strong convictions around how we should be approaching and regulating TE investment. So we really appreciate that, and I think it was really a high mark for dockets in terms of the amount of time that stakeholders took to publish their comments. And this is a very common process, as Nolan mentioned, in our non-contested cases that we count on for public comment. Okay, so next slide. So the resulting work was a policy recommendation by staff. Staff brought forward in December of 2021. And it was modified, it was adopted, but with some modifications. So we brought forward, reflecting stakeholder input, this updated transportation electrification investment framework. It was a basis for commission and stakeholders to evaluate the next TE plans. It called for a guardrail of infrastructure spending that was derived from what we think is the best evidence-based assessment of infrastructure needs that align with state policy goals. And that is a methodology that ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation, brought forward. So we made that part of our recommendation. We established proposed performance areas, 6 different types of considerations that utilities should demonstrate how their TE plans advance. These range from greenhouse gas emissions to distributional equity and outreach, as Isel mentioned, infrastructure adequacy, and a range of portfolio areas. And then we laid up a path forward for more robust benefit cost analysis as we move forward. And the commission adopt our recommendation. As you see, it doesn't always go exactly as staff proposes. There were some modifications, and that's the way this, this order went down. And so as a result, the commission, however, did direct staff to open a rulemaking and explore adoption of staff's transportation electrification investment framework. Next slide. And so now, with all that kind of initiation phase work done, staff launched with stakeholders the informal phase of our rulemaking in Q1 of this year. And I just included a screenshot here. The administrative rules are on the Secretary of State's website, and it's chapter 860 that contains all of the areas in which PUC has authority. TE happens to be Division 87. So our effort now is to revise these rules, working to reflect all of those learnings and the policy into a final set of rules that will go into effect in August. So next slide. As part of the informal phase that Nolan talked about, we worked again with stakeholders to submit 2 rounds of draft rules. Here's a screenshot of some of the red lines that staff implemented to reflect the feedback on those rounds. And we then brought that forward in the informal phase, that was adopted. The informal rules as proposed by staff were adopted by the commission. And then the commission, in that order I cite here, directed the opening of a formal rulemaking phase. So this is when it gets a lot more buttoned down. And that's where we find ourselves today. While staff led the informal phase, the formal phase is now being led by an assistant law judge. In this case, Sarah Spruce is our ALJ leading the formal phase. And Nolan, if you'd go to the next slide, please. I threw this slide in just as a way of showing how staff's draft rules are addressing requirements that were brought forward in the, or required rather by the House Bill 2165. And if you could continue forward on the next slide, you'll see this is our schedule. So staff really gives a lot of thought to these schedules, and we hope they work for stakeholders as much as possible. Sometimes we ask and do Google polls to see how many of you can all make this date. We're always trying to optimize that. and give a lot of thought to making the best use of your time. The STAR is where we are now, and we have one more workshop to put forward and talk about some guidance. The guidance is just a supporting kind of documentation that helps in the interpretation of the rules. We think there are a lot of issues that don't belong in rules because they're too detailed, or we want more flexibility to revise those issues. We might want to revise the metrics by which these portfolio performance areas are measured and tracked. You know, say a unit changes. Well, we don't really want that in rules. We would like to have a supporting staff guidance document that could be reviewed every year by the commission. So it's that kind of supporting work we're doing now. There'll be a special public meeting on August 9th. And then we'll bring this, the assistant law judge, rather, not me anymore, but our assistant law judge will bring forward the final formal rules to be considered for adoption on August 23rd. And at that point, if that goes well, utilities will be able to file their next transportation electrification plans, reflecting all that good stuff. And that will be for the years 2022 through 2025. And that concludes my case study. I'd probably stop for questions or any reflections before I hand over to Nolan. I hope that was relatively clear. And any questions on how that life cycle process is going? Okay. All right, Nolan. Well, for sure, ask any questions later down the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to talk through a couple other case structures before we finish up this part of the presentation. Rate cases. So as I mentioned earlier, these are major contested cases. Jim Kreider's question earlier asked, when a utility makes an investment around wildfire or another issue, or in this case, transportation electrification, how is that reflected in rates, and how is that how are those costs, to the extent they are, shared between customers and investors? Well, the place that gets determined is a rate case. These are major proceedings where the commission really examines all aspects of a utility's rates. Some cases that have occurred recently or that are in progress, UG 433 for Avista, which provides gas services to some customers in Oregon. Northwest Natural currently has an open rate case, UG 435. And then Pacificor, one of our largest electric utilities, also has a currently open rate case in which the commission is considering all sorts of investments, including renewable investments as part of rate base. So when we handle a rate case or another contested case, what are the expectations there for participation? Let's talk about that for a moment. So again, as I mentioned earlier, these are trial-like processes which resolve disputed issues of fact and law. There's evidence. The commission is making its decision. Certainly there's some policy determinations, but ultimately the commission is making its decision based on an evidentiary record, based on facts submitted by the various stakeholders that participate. Because it's a contested case, the way you get engaged is by becoming an intervener. You make a filing, you say, and instructions are on our website. This is why we have a right to intervene. This is why we have a right to participate. We won't burden the process, and we're going to help the commission get to an answer. We're going to make our case. Typically, for full participation in a rate case or in a contested case, it really does help to have an attorney representing your group. It's not exclusively necessary. We have granted intervention without an attorney representing a group, but it is difficult to participate in all aspects of a case without an attorney, because legal argument in a contested trial-like proceeding can really only be made by an attorney. So if you want to make a legal argument in a case like a rate case, you're going to need an attorney. If you just want to make a practical argument or a policy argument, an attorney is not strictly necessary. In these cases, ex parte restrictions apply. So because the commissioners are really acting as judges, that means that for fairness sake, we can't talk to them as parties outside the presence of other parties. So if you've intervened in a rate case, the commission is not going to meet with you to talk about it. You're not going to be able to call up our executive office and say, hey, I'd like to meet with Chair Decker and talk about this pending rate case. All that discussion needs to happen out in the open. It needs to happen through your filings, through the arguments you file, through the testimony you file, through the briefs you file. And rate cases are major cases. They really can address any issues associated with rates and operations of a utility. So as I mentioned earlier, you can participate without an attorney. And I think this is important primarily for smaller groups that don't have maybe extensive funding to engage at the commission. So to do that, there's a couple things you'll need to ensure. You'll have to have a person that can truly represent an organization that's been designated by that organization as an authorized representative. As I said earlier, you can't make legal arguments, but you can make policy arguments. You can provide testimony and provide evidence that addresses a factual question. And then, of course, we sometimes have cases where an individual customer is going up against a utility service provider. And in those cases, individuals may represent themselves. And in that narrow instance, there are circumstances where those individuals may make legal argument. Additionally, there are other ways to participate in rate cases. You can provide public comment. And we have a new procedure where staff will actually review all public comments prior to filing testimony, and will summarize those comments in their testimony so that the commissioners directly on the record have information about what the public is advocating for. Some things to expect in a contested case. They start with a pre-hearing conference. So what is a pre-hearing conference? Well, we get everyone together and we discuss the schedule. We identify the parties and we set that for the remainder of the case. At some point, testimony will be required. So this is where the commission is soliciting evidence. They're essentially saying, all right, we have the utility filing. They're telling us what the rate should be and why. What do you think? What is your perspective? People provide that in testimony. We'll do a public comment hearing. So this is really the customer accessible event where the commission will hear from the public. And really anybody can come forward and say anything they'd like about the rate case. We'll have an evidentiary hearing unless people waive it. And this is an opportunity for everyone to test the evidence. So you can cross-examine different parties based on their testimony, dig into what they've said and ask hard questions, testing their conclusions. And typically, if you want to participate in a hearing, you really need an attorney. As we progress in a contested case, we'll have briefing. So this is a written argument as to why your position as an advocate should be the one the commission adopts. And as I said earlier, if you're going to make a legal argument, really need an attorney to support you. And then often, but not always, for large cases, we use oral argument, which is a situation where a panel of representatives of the organizations or stakeholders or utilities participating in a case come before the commission. They make their case in 5 to 15-minute increments, and then the commission asks questions of them. And so it's an oral back and forth in front of the commission. Ultimately, the commission issues a final decision. So at some point, the commission we close the record, and ALJ closes the record, and then the commission reviews everything and weighs all the evidence and issues sometimes an extremely extensive written decision. So that's a rate case. As I promised, I'm going to talk a little bit about IRPs now. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a moment because we've reached the end of our presentation, and I'll talk a little bit about integrated resource planning. So integrated resource planning is where utilities put forward on a 2-year basis, really a full plan for how it will serve its customers. Both our natural gas and our electric utilities utilize this process. And as our participant indicated earlier, this is important for if you're interested in climate change, because really these plans outline how the utility is going to serve itself, often up to 20 years. So it lays out all the types of resources that the utility is going to utilize and justifies them. It's a plan. And anyone can participate in these processes. They are hybrid processes. So they're not contested. The commission makes these decisions in a public meeting, but they're really sprawling. And sometimes there's access to highly confidential, detailed information. So we manage them within ALJ, a little like a contested case. We'll hold a pre-hearing conference, we'll set a schedule, and we'll keep track of everyone as parties to ensure that we know who has access to what type of information. Ultimately, everyone will present a recommendation to the commission, and the commission will make a decision one way or the other as to acknowledge a utility's plan to serve its customers or not acknowledge it. And it is meaningful to have an acknowledged plan, but ultimately it's not binding on either the commission or on the utility, meaning that when a utility has a plan, they can follow it, build it, the resources that they said they were going to build, but they still have to come into the commission in a rate case and ask for those resources to be found prudent in order to charge customers for them. They can't charge customers for those resources unless the commission has authorized that in a rate case. So even though they have a plan that might be acknowledged, they still have to make their case in the rate case that what they did was the right thing to do, that it was reasonable, that it was prudent, that it was consistent with the law. And so acknowledgement helps them make that case, but it is not determinative. And the rubber meets the road ultimately in those rate cases. And so I think we have a question here regarding rate cases from Hannah Cruz, and it says, do rate case numbers stay the same throughout the utility's ongoing rate cases? I.e., does Pacific Power's rate case stay as UE 399 this year and in 5 years? That's a good question. And so the answer is that throughout the pending rate case, it's the same number. Once the commission makes a decision and there's compliance filings and things like that that might follow on in the rate case, if the company comes in and asks for new rates, then that would get a new docket number. So I think the answer to your question, Hannah, is no, it doesn't stay the same. So if, for example, after Pacific Power's order is issued in UE 399, they want to come in 2 or 3 years and get new rates and want to justify a rate change, at that stage, they'll have a new docket. It'll be, UE 425 or whatever, wherever we are, we issue these numbers in sequential order. So I hope that answers that question. So I hope that little bit on IRPs gives you a little context for how important they are. They're much like some of the planning, transportation electrification planning documents that Sarah mentioned, and that they're very important. They mean a lot and they have a lot of impact, but ultimately the commission just, will have to make a determination as to whether or not the investments made consistent with those plans are prudent. Okay. Well, we've got 2 things left on our agenda today. The first is a quick update on intervenor funding, which I'm going to do shortly. Why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then I'll get into that. And then around 3 p.m., we will kick off our panel discussion. So we'll take a 5-minute break. and we'll be right back on at 2:45. All right, everyone. Thank you for allowing us a little break. We appreciate that. So we're going to do another one short presentation on intervenor funding to give you a little background here at 2:45. And then we'll move into our panel discussion. All right, so it's 2:45 and I'm going to kick us off here. A moment, I will share my screen. Okay, intervenor funding. So let's begin with the basics. And before we really get into it, I'll just note the purpose of this short presentation is to give you information about where we are with HB 2475 intervenor funding, explain how you can access it right now, and then also give you an update on when formal rules will be complete, which will allow permanent access to this funding. So intervenor funding is financial support to engage in processes at the commission. Currently, it's, longstanding intervenor funding has been available to groups representing broad customer classes. That's been available for quite a long time. But we have new intervenor funding opportunities, and that's what I'm really going to highlight today. So the specific groups getting that now have access to intervenor funding are groups representing low-income residential customers and groups representing environmental justice community customers. So these are two new groups of classes of customers that now have access to funding, and we have made that funding available. It's available today. So there is $500,000 available annually. This is based on agreements between, or it needs to be, according to legislation, it's based on agreements between recipient groups and utilities, and agreements have to be negotiated and will be memorialized in final rules later this year. So taking a step back, HB 2475, an important piece of legislation which really did two things. It created the opportunity for the commission to authorize differential rates. These are rates that help support customers of lower incomes and allowed utilities to design such rates and for us to incorporate whatever costs there are associated with that into overall rates. And so that work has been ongoing. It's very interesting and very important. And the utilities are all individually working in one way or the other to implement that part of the legislation. Another part of the legislation is intended to help representatives of those low-income communities and also environmental justice communities to participate at the commission on a consistent basis. And it allows up to $500,000 annually to be utilized and collected from utilities and provided to groups that meet the requirements of the legislation to participate at the commission. So essentially, groups can get money to do work at the commission and make their points, make their case as to why one policy should be one way, or they can participate in rate cases. All of the things that we've discussed today in terms of process and participation. Well, there's now going to be money available for smaller, newer groups representing environmental justice communities and low-income communities to participate. So we have developed interim funding. So this legislation was passed last year. We issued an order in February, order number 22043, and I have links here that I'll share to that order and other resources, which allows access to that funding today. So this money is available now. It's based on what we have is based on, as required in the legislation, based on an agreement negotiated with the utilities. So it's an interim agreement. Utilities have agreed to make this money available. Groups may request funds in individual dockets, and if approved by the commission, groups will sign agreements with the utilities and receive the funds. The interim process that we have right now requires separate funding requests for each docket. So if you're interested in funding, you can't just ask for money for all of your work at the PUC all at once. You need to go into each docket and propose a budget or information and provide information as to why you're eligible for funding. So let's talk a little bit about eligibility. So there's, as I said earlier, there's two groups eligible. The low-income customers, we've defined that as the interests of residential households at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. I will note that in our order, utilizing that definition, we left it very open. So if the commission in another process comes up with something different, we'll change that. Really, we utilize the definition currently referenced by the commission, but it's a flexible definition, and we could look at something different in the future. Environmental justice communities, we've made funding available very much consistent with the statute, and the statute's very wide-ranging. Communities of color, communities experiencing lower incomes, tribal communities, rural communities, coastal communities, communities with limited infrastructure, and other communities traditionally underrepresented in public processes and adversely harmed by environmental and health hazards. Also seniors, youth, and persons with disabilities. So consistent with this interim agreement we have, which makes funding available now, really most of our dockets are qualify for this funding, or a lot of them do. Essentially, any non-complaint contested cases, so all the rate cases we talked about, rulemakings, non-contested dockets that affect the customer group that you might represent, any of those will qualify. Additionally, if the commission, and the commission has done this in the past, has a named non-docketed process, funding is also available for those types of processes. So the steps for intervening, for accessing intervener funding under the current agreement. We have this on the website so you can see it. But essentially you start if it's a contested case by intervening. If it's not a contested case, you don't need to do that. So we discussed earlier in the day sort of the differences between those types of cases. You'll definitely know. We make it very clear when a contested case is contested. But if it is a contested case, we've included here the template for intervention request. You'll submit a budget, and you'll explain why you're eligible. So you'll explain why you're an eligible group under the interim agreement. You also explain why the process is eligible. So you'll explain why the customer group that you represent, it will be impacted by this docket. The commissioners will then review as a commission, and then we'll decide whether to approve the request either at a public meeting, or in certain cases, I will just issue the order. I've been delegated that authority, or the commission may issue that order. If you're approved, you would sign a commission agreement, a commission approved agreement with the specific utility in question. And we have the form here. It's one agreement for all utilities to make it convenient, so it doesn't change. And it's here in order 2243. You work in the case. That's where the real work occurs. You track your organization's involvement of the docket consistent with your budget. And then you request payment. And we've got examples here for how that is done. We review that request for payment. Unless there's some significant deviation in your budget, which you have not explained, because you certainly can deviate from your budget as long as you explain why that occurred. You know, sometimes the case doesn't require the amount of work that you might have anticipated. We approve those requests, and once the utility acknowledges that that approval has occurred, the utility issues payment. So as I mentioned, we've got these resources available on the website, much more detail than I'm providing here. I definitely suggest you check that out on our intervener funding page. You've got the key order for the interim agreement. We've got templates and some other resources. And I'm definitely a resource on this. So if you ever have any questions, you're trying to figure out how to access these funds, I know it can be complicated. Please contact me directly. I can help you. We've already had our first request, which has been approved. And so if you want to see an example of how this works, there's a request from Rogue Climate that's publicly accessible in AR 638 and UM 2207. They've got their request to designate the proceeding as eligible and that Rogue Climate is eligible. They've got their proposed budget, and then there's an order there as well approving that request. And Keisha, as in the chat, shared the link to the intervener funding page. Thank you, Keisha. Okay, I'm going to talk now. That's the interim agreement. So we wanted to make sure that funding was available really all year. So we finished this interim agreement. You can access funding right now. It's being provided, but we know that there's going to be a much different long-term permanent agreement, and that'll be reflected in rules. And that work is being done in AR 652. It's a rulemaking docket. So if you're interested in this subject area, please sign up for that service list. Contact us directly at the filing center. You can, and all that information is available on our website in the various contact and participation pages if you want to follow this rulemaking. And so AR 652 is a rulemaking to develop the permanent rules which will implement this new intervener funding opportunity. And because the legislation requires an agreement between advocates receiving funding and utilities, we've structured at least the first part of the rulemaking as a negotiation. So the negotiation is currently ongoing. It's occurring between all the utilities have agreed to negotiate it as a group, which is very beneficial and helpful because instead of having a bunch of individual agreements, we're going to have hopefully one agreement with all utilities and then advocates on the other side. Because this is such a significant commitment of time, there's been a subset of advocates that have agreed to really act as lead negotiators. And they've been in contact with a broader group of interveners about their priorities. And that is Rogue Climate, Verde, and CEP, Community Energy Project. And so we're facilitating that negotiation. The Citizens Utility Board CUB is providing some really helpful support and background information since they have so much experience with intervener funding. We held the first negotiation session on May 24th. We held another one in June. We'll hold another one in July. There will be a broader update to the AR 652 service list coming very soon. I've been working on that. So we'll update you on some of the details that we've been discussing in these conversations. So ultimately, what's going to happen is we're going to hopefully have a negotiated agreement. Is this agreement set in stone? Absolutely not. What it's going to be is going to be something that will be published in the docket. It will not be adopted by the commission until the commission has had a chance to hear from really any member of the public that wants to talk about it. Additionally, that negotiation will form the basis of a potential rule proposal from the Administrative Hearings Division, but that won't be adopted as rules until we go through that rulemaking process that we discussed earlier in the training. So We're going to have all that process associated with public comment and engagement and workshopping for this intervenor funding as we do for really any rule. So just something to make note of. The legislation requires us to have this negotiation, but that won't be the end of it at all. It's really the beginning of talking about the rules. Okay, I promised to keep that pretty short so we could stay on track for our panel discussion at 3 o'clock. But I'll stop here to see if there are any questions or thoughts folks would like to share before we begin our panel. Okay. All right. Well, I think we've got I think we've got through everything. Ellie, so let's make sure to allow Megan and Jeff, Angela, Sherry, and Bob to turn on their cameras for the next stage of.
Everyone should have access to do that.
Okay, great. So if you all could turn on your cameras, that would be great. We'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, let's see. We've got Jeff, Julie, and Bob. Okay, everybody's on camera, and I think you can also unmute yourselves as well. So while you do that, I'll provide a little introduction to our panel. All right. Well, we've heard a lot today. We've gone through quite a bit of detail on transportation electrification. You've heard a great deal of background on the commission and how we work as an agency. And then now you've heard a little bit about intervenor funding as well. And as we've discussed, there are many situations where environmental policy and climate change is addressed by the commission or implicated in rates. And many of the stakeholders newer to our processes are focused on this important area. So as we seek to implement a series of really key legislative directives, and as we examine new utility investments in areas that utilities have not traditionally played a role in, like transportation electrification, facilitating robust participation from stakeholders is really important and a real priority for the agency. And so that's the purpose of our discussion today, our panel discussion. And through this discussion, we look to support new participants in our process by providing an opportunity for experienced advocates to present direct feedback to others about successful advocacy at the commission. So we have some questions here, although we're really spurring conversation, but the idea is that we get some really good information for you about effective advocacy at the commission. And so I'll take a moment here to provide a little background on each of our participants, and we have 5 folks volunteering their time today. We really appreciate that. First, Commission Chair Megan Decker. So Megan Decker was appointed to the commission by Governor Brown in April of 2017 and was promoted to commission chair in May 2018. Chair Decker has led the commission during what have arguably been the most active legislative sessions in the commission's history for utility-focused legislation. Additionally, Chair Decker serves on many of the regional bodies working to address the broad transformation of the electric industry, principally on regional cooperation, transmission, and markets. From 2010 to 2015, she served as counsel to Renewable Northwest and advocated for clean energy before utility commissions in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. Bob Jenks is the executive director of the Citizens Utility Board. He has extensive experience working here at the commission. He helped found the Citizens Utility Board, and has worked with individual commissioners, staff, and stakeholders for many years, and is known as an extremely effective advocate. He also represents Oregon on various national groups focused on consumer advocacy. And I know from dealing with consumer advocates in other states that he is well known and respected across the country for his work here in Oregon. Next, we have Jeff Bissonette, who works to provide strategic advice on legislative and regulatory issues and on DEI related issues in new energy policies to the Northwest Energy Coalition. NWEC focuses on reforming utility, buildings, and transportation policy and programs to reduce climate change pollution and to hasten the development of clean, affordable, and equitable energy resources. Jeff also has a long history of advocating at the Commission, including time working with the Citizens Utility Board and the now Oregon Solar and Energy, Solar and Storage Industries Association. Sherry Vilmark is a program director with the Community Energy Project, and we've mentioned CEP a couple times today. CEP provides direct in-home safety repairs, weatherization, and energy efficiency upgrades for vulnerable and underserved populations in Oregon. Sherry has nearly 20 years of experience in a variety of community education approaches, including environmental interpretation, voter education and mobilization, skill building, public speaking, consulting, and advocacy with decision makers, including this commission. And then finally, last but not least, Angela Crowley-Koch. Angela is Executive Director for the Energy, Solar Plus Storage Industries Association. She was previously the Legislative Director at the Oregon Environmental Council, and her work was instrumental in passing the Toxic Free Kids Act, renewing the Clean Fuels Program, and legislation transitioning Oregon away from coal, among other legislation. She has worked for Senator Jeff Merkley in various roles. And then while in DC, she negotiated policy for Oregon in the Food Safety Modernization Act and the key transportation packages, including closing a loophole in the Buy America rules, among other policies. All right, well, those are the bios, and really the purpose here is to have a robust conversation about effective advocacy at the Commission, and I really want to give our volunteer panelists the opportunity to take it in a direction they would like to take it in, and we really appreciate their involvement. But I'm going to ask a few questions to sort of spur conversation. But as I've told our participants earlier, they're free to sort of interject and let the conversation flow where it will. But to get things started, we'll start with Chair Decker. So Megan, if you could help us here, how is the PUC's changing role with regard, or how is the PUC's role changing with regard to stakeholder engagement? And specifically, in your time advocating before the Commission and your time with the Commission, how has the PUC's approach to stakeholder engagement evolved or changed?
Hello, everyone, and I think you can hear me okay. I think this is a great question, and I have a little bit of a weird response. Like, I don't think the role is that different. The PUC's role in stakeholder engagement has always been to provide an open process that accommodates all perspectives on the question at hand and allows for presentation of the best available information and analysis to support sound decisions. And the PUC has always, in my experience, looked to find processes that work for that, for the organizations that need to get things done at the Commission and those who have a strong interest in how they do it. When I began as an advocate, which was in the year 2010, it was a pretty small universe, and most of the time the PUC could carry out that role of sort of providing that process by doing something that worked for the utility, the consumer advocates, and staff, and a few odds and ends. And at Renewable Northwest, I was felt a little bit like one of those odds and ends. It was my job to advocate at utility commissions, but I kind of straddled that insider-outsider line, leaned heavily on Citizens Utility Board to help me, and in turn sort of helped others navigate the PUC process. So I guess to return to the point, what's changing, I think, at the PUC is not necessarily the role or the goal of providing a process that works for those who need to get business done or care how it gets done, but the challenge of carrying out that role effectively. As the scope and importance of the issues we are tasked to take up grows, so does the interest in the PUC's work and the diversity of perspectives that the PUC needs to provide a process to hear. And I think one thing that looks different is that to effectively hear the perspectives that are coming from more places today and allow their information to come forward to support the PUC's decision making, we've recognized that we should be trying to take a more active role in education and explanation and demystifying our work and facilitating access to those new intervener resources that Nolan was talking about. So again, a lot has changed, and somehow the goal is the same. It's just having to be carried out in a what I guess I see as a more complex landscape.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Any thoughts from our panelists on that? If not, no problem. I have other questions.
I'd like to add in just one thing. Angela from OSEA, thanks for the invitation to participate. In my short time coming before the PUC to advocate, I have definitely noticed more stakeholder engagement, and I'm really pleased about that and hope to see even more. Because to me, as a newcomer, when I started at OSEA, coming before the PUC was pretty intimidating. I was used to coming before the legislature, which is a little bit more of an informal process, and also a process where anyone can come up and say whatever they want for 3 minutes, which is not quite the case in front of the commission. Maybe I'll save my editorial on that for later, but it does. Since in just the 4 years that I've been at OSEA, the process for engaging has become a little less formal, which I think is more inviting for outsiders. And there's been more of these workshops, which I think is terrific, and training. So a thank you to the staff and the commission for working on making it more accessible. And I'm looking forward to talking about ways to make it even more accessible.
Great.
Yeah, I would follow up with that to, and I know like you're going to ask questions, or I'm going to talk about this a bit, but it's kind of like, who are stakeholders? As one of the only community-based organizations that does direct service in this space, I definitely didn't feel like it was an accessible process when we started, because I got involved not as an advocate or a legislative expert or in that arena at all, but as somebody brought in with a low income lens. And that was in 2016. And since then, I would agree with Angela, it's become a really different, much warmer, friendlier relationship. And that's not just like, oh, I'm more savvy in it. I'm not as savvy as I feel like I should be in how the PUC works. I'm learning a lot from these workshops, even though I've been involved since 2016, because it's only about, 4% of my job. Like, I'm doing lots of other things, so I have to learn on the fly. But like, even I commented in the chat about like the funny slide, like 6 years ago, there's no way we would have even had like a cute slide in a presentation. And these kinds of things like make it so that before we'd step up to like this, there'd be like a podium with microphones up above, and then you'd have to choose a chair, and maybe you chose a chair with a microphone in front of it. Who sat at that inner circle round table, like in those public spaces? And it is extremely intimidating. And especially if you are so new to the space, you wonder, what value am I bringing? If I don't understand what everybody's talking about, who am I to speak in those spaces? That sort of thing. And I would say, as a woman who grew up really low income, like as you start to diversify your stakeholders, we're all going to be bringing with us, like, what makes me feel safe enough to say what needs to be said and what the PUC needs to hear. And these little changes that have happened, and also like every interaction I've had with PUC staff, especially the past, I would say 3 or 4 years, has been so helpful, so warm, so inviting, so ready to like drop everything and answer questions to ensure our engagement. And that sort of thing goes a really long way.
Thank you, Sherry. That was great. Okay, well,
And I can tell we're going to need,
Yeah.
tell we're going to need to get some feedback on hearing room design once we start having more in-person meetings again, given both of your comments there. So.
That's right. That's right. And your experience is, you're not alone. I remember my first time practicing before a commission, I accidentally sat in the witness chair, not knowing that it was the witness chair. So let's go right back to you, Sherry, for our next question. Your group has a really interesting role with the commission, as CEEP supports the administration of a commission-sponsored program, Community Solar, but also has direct advocacy on behalf of customers at the commission in other dockets, principally, as you said, around low-income customer issues and energy efficiency. From this diverse experience, what have you learned about how the public interacts with and understands the work of the commission? If you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that as I began work with the PUC, it was around community solar. That was the only experience I'd ever had around that. And our focus, for those that don't know, is we're the low-income facilitator. Community solar has this 10% low-income mandate kind of tacked on to this program that wasn't really made to be friendly to low-income folks. And we were a stakeholder, and then eventually became the low-income facilitator. And I'll say that trying to balance the needs of diverse stakeholders, because the people at that table, we had low-income folks, we had environmental justice folks, we had solar developers, utilities, you had people who were concerned about rates, you had labor, you had environmentalists, all wanting different things that were sometimes opposing. And it was kind of a little bit of, sometimes I feel like community solar is like everyone got together to build themselves a racehorse, and we ended up with kind of a funny little camel, because the PUC had the unenviable position of, weighing out a lot of options and having options that kind of pleased some people, kind of pleased everybody, and kind of ticked everybody off at the same time, which probably means you found a pretty decent balance. So I would say that, like, what had to be built was, I would say, a lot of mutual trust, and then, trust in expertise, which I would say, CEP did not have at first. There was a lot of prove it around things, which is difficult when you're talking about ethical things, but understanding that the PUC itself is a risk-averse organization that's very careful and has a heavy responsibility to protect ratepayers. I'd say that, it was an interesting and kind of challenging relationship at first that has grown over time. We do not do a lot of bringing clients or participants to the PUC space, and we don't do a lot of talking about the PUC, but in the outreach arena of community solar, it can, I would say, lend legitimacy, not because people know what the Public Utility Commission is, but because it sounds very official, and we're basically like, look, they're regulators, they're government, like they're overseeing something, and they're there to, like, be protective of you. And there are times where in community solar, when we're doing low income recruitment and outreach and intake and having conversations with people, we are able to like utilize, like, we do use you as a form of legitimacy so that people can trust what you're doing. But bringing folks in around the other way is a lot trickier. And I don't have good solutions on how to make it easier, because I think the systems themselves are tough. Like, you have to be in stuff in the legislative world for the long haul, for years. I mean, I started in community solar in 2016, and we're still doing legislative stuff. Like, we're still doing like different like rulemaking aspects. There's like one open for comment right now. And so that kind of marathon approach does make it tricky to engage the public. And the times that we have, it's been extremely focused. We had a rate case. We wanted to let customers know, hey, rates are going to increase with different utilities. You know, if you want to speak about how this affects you, this is how you do it. But the people we're working with often don't have internet or stable enough internet to even join a meeting. Even if it's easier than traveling to Salem, which was, you know, a whole different kind of barrier, or work evenings. So even having stuff in evenings, which is a good time to have like workshops, there are still like these additional barriers that can make it tough for people to engage. Or, hey, look at this look at the rulemaking, and it's really long and it's really detailed, and you know, this is a 19-page PDF. Do I have time to read this and understand it and feel confident enough to weigh in on it? So we have done some translating where we've narrowed down. We're like, here's the Cliff Notes version, and here's some language, and here's where you can read the whole thing if you want to. But if you don't have time for that, we're relying on their trust in us to interpret stuff well, to like bring them to the arena. So there's just a lot of steps, and sometimes, you know, the timelines make it hard to do that. I actually kind of started to forget your question, so hopefully I answered it somewhere in there.
I think you hit it, definitely.
Can I ask her a follow-up?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, please.
You did invite crosstalk. I'm just curious, given the challenges you just described in the sort of direct, I am one customer kind of, or utility ratepayer engagement, what do you think we're missing there? Like, what isn't coming through? Like, when should we be trying to overcome those barriers, and when should we be relying on a translator, as you just described it, to help us understand those experiences that we might be missing?
I think one of the hard things is, you know, when people don't know what they don't know. And so not knowing who the PUC is or what the PUC does is already a barrier to overcome. So the place where we've been at is like, it's been focused on like direct customer impact. So your rates going up is very clear. It's very, very simple. So we're like, hey, your rates would go up. It'd go up by 12% or whatever. This is the timeline. So here are the people you complain to, or you bring your thoughts to, because they have influence over whether or not this occurs. So we're able to do something like that. Different kinds of longer, more complicated processes, such as distribution systems planning. I've been asked a lot, how do we bring customers into the DSP space? I'm like, oh God, well, rename it first of all. But like, you know, how do we bring relevancy? And I think this is hard. I think the PUC's, like, I can be kind of biased, right? Like CEP as a stakeholder has opinions about things. So we can say like, hey, here's this thing, we don't like it. Here's why we don't like it. We think it's going to hurt you. And here's why. Like, come advocate for yourself, as opposed to releasing something that has to be much more neutral, that people have to like read and understand the nuance and understand impact really clearly. So I don't know if it's something more like kind of like how our voters pamphlets work, where we're like, hey, here's some some pros and cons, or here's some different things that people are saying about it, and here's the impact on you as a voter, only it would be you as a ratepayer. Something like that, that's much briefer, and I would say at a reading level, like there's a thing where like you write at a third grade reading level, not because people are third graders, but because even people with a PhD understand things better at a third grade level. Like it's not a page, right? I like to read at the third grade level too. I'm like, oh, what does all this mean? So I think that, you know, the idea that a professional document has to be difficult to navigate, you know, is something that's antithetical to the democratization of information, which I think is what we're really, you know, asking here. It's like, how do we democratize this information so that more people can take part in that? And I think it takes practice, and I think it takes like putting stuff out there. And, you know, you have a lot of great stakeholders that have been in the space for a long time. And I think that community-based organizations, more and more of us are starting to enter it and ask for funding to support it. And intervener funding is, you know, a wonderful way that that's been introduced. But like, we have to have mission alignment too. And so it took us a while to figure out, we're like, we're a direct service entity. What does this have to do with our mission? And had to realize that for ourselves. Did I answer your question? I feel like I talked a lot.
That's great.
I'm learning a lot. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
If I could just chime in a little bit on this issue of what I like how Sherry said, the democratizing of information and just the accessibility of PUC dockets and hearings in general. There are a lot of folks who care about what happens at the PUC, but just you don't have the capacity to be engaged all the time. And I'm not even talking about your average ratepayer. I'm talking about other environmental groups, for example, who care a lot about implementing all the climate change bills that they worked really hard to pass, but they don't have the capacity, or, you know, just aren't focused on PUC. And so at those moments when folks who are not everyday participating in the PUC, when they care about an issue and want to participate in a docket, I feel like we could do a better job of making space for those folks who are not in the weeds, those folks who do need that third grade reading level because they just haven't been involved in and don't know, you know, where we're at in the distribution system plan or even community solar. And so, you know, the public hearings at the PUC are very focused on, you know, stick to your particular points, don't repeat what other people say. But that's tricky for people who haven't been engaged, but have thoughts to share and opinions and represent people in Oregon. And so, you know, I know the commission has such crowded agendas and really full meetings, but I think in that effort to democratize or to make it more accessible, it would be good if there could be some way for folks to repeat what other people have said, just so that they can voice their concerns and add in that they care about an issue in a particular way.
Great. Thank you, Angela. Any, Bob or Jeff, anything you want to comment on there, or I can move on to another question?
I think it's okay to move on, so.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Well, Angela, I'll go right back to you. So you've advocated in front of the commission for a number of years, as you mentioned, and your organization has a member base that is directly affected by commission decisions. How do you feel, or how do you work to ensure that the commission hears the perspective of your members, and, you know, do your members feel comfortable coming before the commission to make their case for a specific policy?
Yeah, it's an interesting balance. Part of the reason that companies join OSEA, and not just companies, we have other stakeholders, nonprofits, public agencies. One of the reasons that people join OSEA is to have us advocate on their behalf. Because if they come to the PUC later for a particular issue for their project in a contested case or a complaint or another situation, they want to be able to come in front of the commission and staff with, I guess, a more clean slate. And so OSEA is called upon to advocate on behalf of the entire industry. But I will say we wear two hats at OSEA. We have OSEA as a trade association. We also have the Oregon Solar Energy Education Fund that advocates on behalf of the public good. And so when we're wearing our education fund hat, we're not just advocating on behalf of our members, but in general to create more access to solar and reduce barriers. So yeah, it is hard sometimes as an individual stakeholder to come in front of the PUC, and it's more helpful to have someone advocate on your behalf, and that's why we like people to join OSEA. We can speak for them.
Great, thank you. So I've got another question for Jeff. So Jeff, like a couple of folks here, you've held numerous advocacy roles over the years, and you've had responsibility for making policy cases to the commission. Similarly to what we asked Chair Decker earlier, how is your opinion as to the commission's approaches to stakeholder engagement changed over time? Have you noticed a change in your time advocating before the commission?
Yeah, I think I'll amplify a little bit what the chair said and it's definitely gotten more complex. When I started advocating at the commission and on energy and utility issues in general, you could get 20 people in a room and figure out pretty big policy. And so that's scary enough. The other scarier thing is that nobody cared. They'd pat you on the head and send you on your way. It's like, oh, go work on that energy stuff. Let us know how that goes. And that's not the way it is anymore, and that's a good thing. A lot more people care about energy. A lot more people care about climate. And as the chair said, there's a lot more people that are taking an interest in the commission's work as the issues become more diverse, and that's a good thing. But it's how to make what has been a very formal process more welcoming, more accessible is the job of all of us. I'm going to focus on two other
Sure.
quick things. One is that the biggest thing I think that is changing is the focus on equity and diversity. Again, back a number of years ago, if you were talking about energy assistance for low-income people, you were kind of checking the equity box, and that's not the way it is anymore, and rightly so. And so, and just in the in the 2021 session, I think that there were 4 pieces of legislation that specifically called out equity. And I think that we're not, within the PUC context, we're not dealing with equity kind of as a whole. It's, equity within 2021, equity within 2475, equity within 3141, equity within, 2165. And we have a DEI director that, was a big deal for the commission to do. It seemed like for a while, any topic that came up on equity before Iselle Watson was hired was, well, that'll be under the DEI director. And I was like, boy, I'm gonna hate to see what his daily calendar looks like. And I think that's kind of come true because he's one busy guy. And so I think that as we figure out more about equity and diversity, we need to think more about how to deal with that holistically across dockets, across issues, and really, encourage the commission to keep going on its path to figure out how to embed, DEI and equity work, not just in a single individual or not just within a DEI staff, which, by the way, I think need a larger DEI staff, but to really keep thinking more about how to embed DEI across sort of all staff work. And then the last thing I'll say is, I got seriously involved in commission work around the time of energy deregulation and restructuring. And at that time, we had put together a coalition called the Fair and Clean Energy Coalition to both advocate in the legislature and then in the PUC. And the great thing about that is we were all kind of teaching each other, because nobody really knew what they were doing. Bob Jenks and Jason Eisdorfer with the Students Utility Board were a little bit farther ahead than the rest of us, but we all kind of taught each other and learned the rules together. And so I think that coalition and linking arms and figuring out together was helpful then, and I think can be continue to be helpful today.
Yeah, I'll mirror what Jeff said about the DEI focus. To give like an example, when we started designing community solar and we were designing like the intake process, really getting into details, we were like, okay, and here's all the demographic information we're going to gather, like race, ethnicity, veteran, disability, et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, the PUC's response was like, well, the rules say it's income, so that's what you need to track. Why would you track anything else? Like, as a genuine question and maybe polite discouragement. We're like, well, we're going to track it. Maybe we just won't tell you if you don't want to know. And just being there, like less than 5 years ago, to where we're at now, where there's so much, it's like there's so much more like openness and immediately understanding, I feel like, from PUC staff and commissioners. I get to see less of the commissioners than I do of staff, but like, oh yeah, I see the relevance there. Of course that's relevant. Of course that makes sense. Of course we want, it's so different, and it's really wonderful to see. It's really encouraging.
That's great. I appreciate that focus. And we have a question here from Knowledge Murphy. So Ellie, can we unmute Knowledge?
Hello. In this discussion of equity and diversity, I would like to know, in the past, because I've only been with the county basically during the pandemic, has there been more than 2 African Americans in a meeting representing the African American community? And I ask that because I'm only present because this is within the scope of my work at the county. If I were not at the county, I would not be at these meetings. I would not be aware of what's happening with the Public Utilities Commission. I wonder if Ezel were not working as the DEI staff at the PUC, would he be attending these meetings? And so without both of us being present, how many African Americans do you expect would be attending these meetings? And with that being the case, how can that change? How can you increase participation within the African American community? Neither myself or Ezel are from Portland, Oregon. We've both moved here to enhance our careers. However, there's a huge amount of people who are directly impacted by decisions made at the PUC who just aren't here, who don't have a voice, who aren't saying anything, who aren't speaking on behalf of themselves or their families or their communities, because there's a disconnect. And so this is not an indictment on anyone. Sure. I just ask, what is being done?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I encourage, I'll speak to it for a moment, and I encourage Chair Decker and the rest of the panel to speak to it as well. And Azel, if Zell would, I know he's still on, if he would like to speak to that, he certainly is welcome to as well. But I will start by saying that, the commission is, and I know this because I work there and I'm part of the effort, it is taking definitive hard steps to increase that participation. And we see it as our responsibility, as our obligation. And so there's a number of things that we're doing to implement that. I think the big things that I can speak to are just the things that I'm working on personally. And that's why I'm going to ask others to speak up if they have things they'd like to mention as well. But for me personally, it's for our group, it's about these trainings, making sure that these trainings are available, that they're responsive, that we're educating people about just how to get involved, and that is accessible at any time. And we want continuous improvement on that. We want these trainings to not just be here, but we want them to improve over time. We want them to get better. This is just the first iteration. The second thing that I know that our group is doing is really conscientiously implementing the intervenor funding piece. And I think that a big part of what we do around intervenor funding, like for example, we wanted to make money ready and available this year. We didn't want to wait. We wanted that available now because there are active things happening right now. And then the other part of it is making sure that people know about that. So I think that a major priority when we get intervenor funding up and running, the idea is to have money for groups, including groups that represent the African American community to participate here. And we want that money utilized, and we want folks to get access to it. So I know that, for example, for intervenor funding, our priorities are making it simple, making it clear, and making sure people know about it, know that it's there. So that's what we're working on with regard to those rules. So that's just speaking for my own division, but I know it's a priority in the agency.
This is Bob. Can I just interject one comment on this?
Yeah.
I've been around for 30 years, and 2 is probably the upper limit of African Americans, of Black people that I've seen in a PUC meeting. And there's clearly ways we can do better. When you look at sort of the demographics of the state, and we've started looking more and more of that as we're looking at various issues. PGE has the largest concentration, the highest percentage of Black customers in the state. Last year when they had a rate case, there was a public input hearing for PGE for that rate case. And we ought to be doing outreach to the African American Alliance for Home Ownership and other Black-based groups in that service territory, so the word is getting out, so the customers know about this, and people can come speak to their experience in that kind of public setting, which is really about what effect is this rate hike going to have on you. So it's something people can talk to, but my guess is nobody even knew about it. So if you don't know about a public hearing, if you don't know about a chance to give a public input, you can't. And I think we're woefully inadequate about reaching out to communities outside of the traditional stakeholders to let them know where there's opportunities for involvement.
And I see Zell is here, so I want to give him a shot, but I had a sort of a follow-up comment on both Knowledge's and Bob's comments about reaching out, but I didn't want to get in the way of Zell.
No. I was just going to briefly say that, kind of seconding things that I've heard already. I think one big tool that we have relative to increasing participation of Black people specifically, but also other identities that would be considered marginalized, including our rural identities, our indigenous persons, tribal nations, other people of color, our Latinx populations, is the expansion of the intervenor funding. One barrier that I have seen to participation is the need to be compensated, because a lot of times people from marginalized identities don't have the bandwidth for participation. That's one. 2, some things that we've been doing here at the PUC that I think will lend itself to more participation of people of color, specifically Black people, are some of the ways in which the PUC has allowed me to spend some funds relative to outreach. Most recently, I attended a Black Rural Network conference, a conference all about Black rural participation in energy. Additionally, we worked with Brown Hope. This is an organization that specializes in elevating and amplifying the voice of our Black community. They were instrumental in the 2114 docket. We hosted some focus groups that were compensated. The outreach part is critical. I think that there is a little bit of a history of distrust of government systems. And so I think having diversity, equity, and inclusion as a job responsibility does help to shore up our reputation and show that we are making efforts at learning more about how to engage in our communities. Other things that I think that we're doing, like for example, having me on board. I attended the Good in the Hood Festival this weekend. It was really, really hot. That's a Black event, by the way. And I was able to make contact with the president of the NAMC, I think it's the National Association of Minority Contractors, and express to that agency where there are opportunities to engage with the PUC. So additionally, we work closely with Energy Trust of Oregon, and they have an established diversity, equity, and inclusion team. So I think while progress may have not moved at the accelerated pace that I know that we all want, I subscribe to what an artist by the name of Common has said. I know it's probably not fully attributed to him, but this is where I heard it. Slow motion is better than no motion. So I think that we are making progress, and I think that we have the opportunity to accelerate, and I'm excited to see what we'll do. Relinquishing the balance of my time, I shouldn't have been speaking anyway. It's not my panel.
Looks like Knowledge has a follow-up.
I think Jeff wanted to speak, but I have something to say.
I'll yield my time, and I see that.
No, go. I mean,
no, Knowledge has his hand up.
Jeff, this is Democratic.
Well,
Please speak.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was muted. Yeah, Jeff, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll go back to Knowledge if he has a question.
I want to make sure questions could get asked. Yeah, I'll just note that again, I first started getting involved in the PUC stuff in 1998, and I came back to Oregon from the Midwest, where I was doing social service advocacy, and I was used to being the only male in the room, and and when I came here, I was like, wow, why are there all guys here? And it was really jarring to me. And I was, also used to working in, the greater Chicago area, in Southern Illinois, and, where there, was a lot of, diversity. And so I think in terms of the gender balance, we've come a long way. But we've still got a lot of work to do, but I have hope that we can build on the progress we've made and continue to make it, as long as we continue to figure out how to institutionalize that progress and that diversity.
Thank you, Jeff. Knowledge, do you have a follow-up question? I'm sorry, Chair Decker.
I guess I just want to say that whatever we're doing as an organization, and Ezel is an important part of that. We have Michelle Scala as a Just Transition Manager. We have the entire utility program staff who are interested, as I really appreciate Sherry bringing up, in really being open to and learning about how equity informs the really hard work that they're doing. And so I do want to be clear that our institutional commitment, while it may be slow, and while, as Sherry said, we may be slow to change or risk averse agency, is to integrate equity considerations more comprehensively in what we're doing. That is not obvious. It is not obvious how to do that in every situation, but I just want to say from my position that you may not see it every day, but it is an emphasis and a commitment.
Absolutely. I can vouch for that. Knowledge, do you have a quick follow-up, and then we're going to get back to some other questions for the panel.
Yes, and I would also like to thank Chair Decker for those comments. I definitely see that the organization is making strides towards addressing some of the issues. And, you know, part of why I'm asking these questions is the only way change happens is to make things uncomfortable. And the organization began in 1843. The Black exclusion laws are passed in 1844. I don't know if there's ever been an African-American commissioner. Ezel seems like a one-man army inside of the organization trying to do so much. And I wonder, you know, is there a plan to increase Ezel's, you know, team? Is there going to be more DEI staff added? Does Ezel have a budget? You know, how can we multiply this? And I'm not saying that progress is not happening. I do not know what's happening behind the scenes at the PUC. All I really see is what's happening at some of these meetings and hearings. And as I've mentioned, if I'm not here, I don't know of any other African-American that actually attends these PUC meetings. And it's just a concern. And it's not an indictment on anybody. It's just going forward, how can we broaden and diversify these things? Because we know energy has a huge impact on people's wealth and their ability to maintain. So that's all. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Absolutely. We appreciate your questions 100% and definitely appreciate the conversation that's engendered. And as Chair Decker indicated, that conversation is very deep and ongoing and very serious for our organization. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to make sure we get to Bob as well before we finish up. We'll probably finish up around 4:10. I wanted to take about 70 minutes at maximum for this panel. So Bob, I have a relatively general question for you, and I really want you to feel free to be expansive with your answer and hit on key points that you think are relevant. Just given your vast experience with the commission, I think stakeholders really benefit from your perspective. So given that experience and CUB's status as regular participants in PUC dockets, do you have general advice on how to effectively participate at the PUC for folks? And also feel free if any part of our conversation has struck you as particularly important, or you haven't heard something that you'd like to hear about, to bring that up as well.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. The first thing is I've looked at the participant list, and I see a number of names who have been on joint comments or comments to the PUC in the last couple of years over proceedings. And quite frankly, some of the folks who have done that could teach me a few things about collaboratively writing comments that are extremely well written and thoughtful. So there's some of folks out there that are doing an extremely good job in submitting some pretty impressive things. So I want to give them credit for that. I appreciate sort of what Megan said, and really the commission has had a focus over the last few years on welcoming more participation and trying to be clear that more parties, including non-traditional parties, will improve decision making. Unfortunately, I don't know if that always shows is reflected when somebody shows up to a meeting. To me, it's somewhat like you're a new kid going to a school in the middle of the school year, and it's your first day, and you're going into the lunchroom. And everyone there has a routine. Everyone else knows what's going on. Everyone has relationships that they're focused on, and they're going about their activities, and they hardly even notice you. And I think this can be similar to that. You can go to a workshop, you can go to things. Everyone's the folks there, the stakeholders, the traditional folks, the PUC staff, the utilities, even my team at times. We've got a purpose at that meeting. We've got what we're focused on, and you're bringing new issues, you're bringing new concerns, you're bringing recommendations that other parties haven't even thought of, and addressing your concerns sometimes just adds to people's workload. So I don't want to say that it's always easy, and that's been true for even myself over the years. When we started working on the boardman issue, when we first proposed that PG model phasing out boardmen, the PUC staff wasn't on board. They objected to that because DEQ hadn't said that was an available option. And so we went out, worked with OEC, Northwest Energy Coalition, and some other groups who were around in that area to do a joint request, and we persisted. And that ultimately got that modeling done. The modeling showed real benefits, and that led to sort of everyone ultimately being on board on the phase out of boardmen. But the real message there is be persistent. Take your message, take what you're trying to get, even if people don't want to deal with it, put it on the table, make us start to think about it. Good ideas sometimes other folks aren't ready to agree with them, but new ideas will never be adopted if they're not first proposed and if somebody isn't out there advocating for them. So don't feel shy. Get in there and do it. The second thing I think is important is why facts and evidence matter. You really have to make your case. And explain your ideas and explain your policies. That's all really critical. But context and narrative also, I think, really, really matter. In a rate case where the commission holds a public comment hearing, it gives members of the public the chance to speak, and hearing from households about their personal experience, I think is really, really important for the context for the commission in a case and in a decision making. And so the roles that you bring, you may be an expert and be able to bring real expertise to a proceeding, or you may be somebody who's an organizer and can organize real people to tell their stories. But I think there's a lot of different ways to give input and give advice and make a difference in this process. The other thing I think that's important is reach out to other folks who have been involved in this. When I first got involved before the Fair and Clean Energy Coalition that Jeff was talking about, there really wasn't anyone other than the staff. And I ended up doing a lot of outreach to Ron Benz, who was then the consumer advocate of Colorado. And he gave me a lot of time, gave me a lot of advice, helped me take what I wanted to do and figure out how do I put those into proposals that could actually be adopted in rate cases. And he was generous with the time. It made a big difference. I made a hell of a lot of mistakes, but I learned from them. And I think that's the case here. There's other stakeholders in this meeting that you can reach out to. And my guess, well, I don't speak from them. My guess is that they would be willing to give you help and advice. I do speak for CUB, and I can tell you that we wrote into our organizational work plan this year that part of our work plan is to help other parties participate at the PUC, other groups who want to get involved. We want to help that. In addition to myself, I'm not an attorney, but we have 2 attorneys on staff with substantial experience at the PUC, both here and in Montana, Mike Getz, and then Jennifer Hill-Hart. Reach out to us. And you're not adding to our workload because we see you as part of our workload. Or reach out to other folks, but getting advice from people who have experience is really helpful. I don't want to get too much into sort of individual proceedings. Proceedings vary so much. A public hearing, a public meeting is much different than an investigation versus a rate case versus an IRP process, and they're all really very different. But I'm willing to give advice on any of those things and offer my help. If folks should, my email is bob@oregoncub.org. Reach out to me, reach out to my staff. But there's definitely we would love to help folks participate in any way that we can. plow ahead, I guess is my final word.
I think that's great advice, Bob.
Can I just pile on to that? Because one of the things I was going to say, and as a piece of advice, is one, strengthen numbers, and two, get technical. Try to spend as much time as you can around people who understand this world deeply. And for me, as an advocate, when I was in that role, that was Bob and that was Jeff on policy issues. And not only is Bob still here giving you his email address, but that is just the way that we build like a robust community of folks that can really offer practical recommendations that give the commission a path forward to change.
Thank you both. Any reactions to some of the thoughts Bob put out there about effective engagement at the commission?
I mean, I can just say that we've come to CUB for their expertise and are never disappointed. Even on, places where, CUB has to take different stances than we do, our focus, being on low income and frontline communities, not all ratepayers. I can say like, they've always been able to answer like our questions and to help us navigate the processes where we're less sure. So I guess just shout out to CUB. They are great to work with.
Jeff, did you have something you want to share?
Nope, just
Okay.
I was gonna put that coalition is also willing, and I'll put my email address in the chat as well.
Great. Well, we are about to wrap up here. We have about 10 minutes. So before we do that, oh, I thought I noticed another hand. So I wanted to, okay, Knowledge, do you have one more question? And then I wanted to give folks an opportunity to sum up and hit any key points they wanted to before we finish up. So Knowledge, why don't you go ahead? Okay.
Yeah, just on the outreach tip, there's a lot of movement happening with the Portland Clean Energy Fund. There are a lot of organizations that are focusing on energy efficiency and weatherization, workforce development. And I think those will be great people to connect with to broaden and increase the outreach to community folks, because they're already going to be focusing on educating members of the community on energy. And so I think it's a great place. There's already some cohesion, and it's a good way to sort of break down some of the silos. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you. I think that's a great suggestion. And we'll definitely highlight that for staff as well. Okay, so like I said, we got roughly 9 minutes left to go. I want to give folks an opportunity for any final thoughts they want to share. And we can just we can go in the opposite sort of way we went to start. Why don't we start with you, Jeff, if you have anything, and then we can go to Angela, Sherry, Bob, and we'll finish up with Chair Decker.
Yeah, real quick, and we could talk for another hour or two about this. I mean, I'm a big believer in sort of learning the rules before you break them. And I also think you need to learn the rules so you can sort of hold institutions accountable. But I think we're also in a time where a lot of the rules that have been in place for 150 years are not working so well anymore. And so I think, in that climate change is top of the list. And I think we finally have the commission having some authority to look at emissions through the passage of House Bill 2021. And that's something that, we've been thinking about for a while. I think that, I think we shouldn't be afraid just to look at the principles that, we've built this industry on: fair, just, and reasonable rates, used and useful, et cetera, and recognize where they can work. And we did close a coal plant using used and useful principles. But at the same time, we may need to come up with new principles to fit our current times. So again, I'll leave that hanging there in a pregnant sort of pause.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you so much for participating. Angela, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think I'll just end by echoing what Sherry said about if you're lost and having questions and want to get involved but aren't quite sure of anything, the PUC staff is very accessible and approachable and really helped me when I was starting out understand the process and the topics and kind of the technical details. So that's my final piece of advice to folks wanting to get more engaged. Don't be afraid, you can do it.
That's right. That's a great message. And the same goes for our administrative staff and the hearings division, the support team. Any of you that know our support team, you'll know that they're very accessible in the filing center. And please, when you have process questions, come to us as well. Sherry.
Yeah, I would say that just on my note about stakeholder engagement, I kind of think about it like you're baking a cake. You don't want to bring your fully baked cake and then ask people to be a part of making it. But it is a good idea to have a recipe to a starting place so that then when you're bringing these stakeholders to the place, they can be like, hey, like no eggs, like change the flavor, change the shape. We need more, we need less, so that you can have that, the expertise of your stakeholders actually shape the final product. So don't bring it too late, but sometimes I think we get brought stuff too early where we show up and I'm like, what do you even got here? What are we even making? Is it cake? Is it rice? What are we doing here? Can be like a little too soon, and you can lose engagement if you aren't moving forward at an interesting pace that is able to engage different kinds of expertise. So that is my analogy that I will close with.
That's great. So essentially, just to make sure I reflect it back properly, having something for people to react to, but that isn't, finished, that isn't complete, and is malleable, and then also making sure that the engagement results in progress that people can see and understand.
Yes, and I would say that we get invited to a lot of spaces because we're like, oh, we know you, we'd like you to come to every space.
Yeah.
But I can barely weigh in on good labor practices, right? You want to bring in labor experts if you're going to be talking about labor. You're going to want to bring in energy efficiency experts if you're talking about energy efficiency or whatever. Because I'll say that if I come to coalition meetings and I'm not saying anything, I just kind of stop coming. And I've seen a lot of different efforts fall apart if there's, you need time to get people to know each other. It's magic zone, but then also people like to see progress and to be really engaged and to see results. So clear expectations is another one. If you're looking for feedback on a mostly finished product and it's yay or nay, thumbs up, thumbs down, say that. Don't pretend that you're ready to make changes if you aren't ready to make them, because those changes that stakeholders bring to you may be really uncomfortable, they may be painful, they may be expensive. And you just have to decide, are those things worth it? I mean, in the low income program with community solar, that came up a lot. It's like, well, are we going to say we're going to do it, or are we going to pay to have it happen? Because if it was easy, it would be done already. So, just coming in with that mindset and being ready to take some risks, and be guided by, ethics and morals as well. When you can't find evidence either way can go a long way too.
Great. Thank you, Sherry. Bob, and we'll finish up with Chair Decker.
Yeah, no, to me, I'm now over 60. I've been engaged in this work for multiple decades now, which is kind of scary. And when you look at the issue of climate change, I feel strongly that it's in the best interest of customers to deal with this. And we know we're going to have to phase out fossil fuel emissions. Science tells us that. And the more we align our energy system with where the end game is, the better for all customers. At the same time, I have to say that after this many years of my work on it, if you look at the emission levels coming out of our energy systems, my generation hasn't done a very good job. We haven't been very successful. We've closed Boardman. We've done the Coal to Clean Act. We've done a lot of policies, but they haven't gotten us very far very quickly. So I do think for folks coming in here on the climate change side, we've got to come up with new policies. We've got to come up with new things. We've got to do things differently. We've got to find new ways to apply the commission authority. And they have to go beyond what people like me have thought of in the past, because that hasn't gotten us very well. So in my mind, you folks should feel free or feel required, feel the urgency to come in here and sort of demand better, demand more, demand that we move quicker, demand that we do things differently, because quite frankly, why there's a lot of things I can pat myself on the back from when I look at those emissions reporting levels from Oregon utilities. It ain't really that much. It ain't. We haven't done that much up until this point. So get involved, do what you can, demand that we do more, and come up with better ideas. And because that's what we really need. So.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. Megan, would you like to sum up?
Oh, okay. I was off schedule there. Thank you all. I mean, this has been a fascinating discussion for me, and I'm really very thrilled to hear so many positive comments about the interactions that folks are having with PUC staff. And I think that the most significant thing that I can say is something about what I learned in my transition from being an advocate to being a commissioner. And, you know, I don't want to minimize the importance and significance of sort of having that final vote in a matter. But these stakeholder processes that you're learning to engage in, and that these folks are, you know, providing us with good ideas for improving, they are where the magic happens, not at that final decision oftentimes. And you in this community are building something, and you're showing the commission what's possible. So I just would want to end with echoing what Bob said about certainly the commission is a kind of institution that needs to make progress in a measured way, but really it can do more and move faster if there is sort of a critical mass, and the stakeholder processes and the compromises and work together that build something up for, you know, an ultimate decision by the commission are where that happens. So just really encouraged to see people interested in being a part of the work that comes to our organization.
Thank you, Chair Decker, for that. And once again, thank you so much to our panelists for really volunteering your time and providing all this insight. Thank you so much to the participants today, particularly those that spoke up and asked questions and made comments. I really appreciate your active engagement. And as I said at the beginning, the entire training today has been recorded, will be available on our website. Again, really appreciate your engagement. So hope you all have a great afternoon.